PodCastle, episode 803, for Tuesday the 5th of September 2023. Part 2 of Quest of the Starstone by C. L. Moore and Henry Kuttner. Read by Caitlin Zavanovich and rated PG-13, with a content note for torture. Good morning, good day, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to PodCastle, the flying castle of fantasy fiction. I'm your host, Matt Dovey, and it's my pleasure to present for your enjoyment Part 2 and the conclusion of Quest of the Starstone by C. L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, narrated by Caitlin Zavanovich. This story was first published at Weird Tales in 1937. Catherine Lucille Moore, January 24, 1911 to April 4, 1987, was an American science fiction and fantasy writer who most often used the pen name C. L. Moore. She was among the first women to write in either genre. Moore's work paved the way for many other female speculative fiction writers. She and her first husband Henry Kuttner were prolific co-authors under their own names and three pseudonyms: Lawrence O'Donnell, C. H. Liddell and Lewis Paget. Henry Kuttner, 7th of April 1915 to 4th of February 1958, was the author of many sci-fi and fantasy short stories in the 30s, 40s and 50s. He was one of the Lovecraft Circle and contributed a number of elements to the Cthulhu mythos. Your narrator is our own Caitlin Zavanovich. Caitlin is a former Marine Corps intelligence officer and current speculative fiction writer. She is a graduate of the Viable Paradise Workshop and writes short stories to avoid editing her novel. She currently lives in Poland with her husband and 4 loud children. You can find her on Twitter at kzavanovich and at copyfold.io/v/Caitlin Zavanovich. Now, last time we heard how Jarell of Joiry bested Franja the Warlock and stole the Starstone from his possession, thus taking its powers of great fortune for herself. Franja, most wroth at his defeat, tracked down Northwest Smith and Yarrow from the Mars of the future and lured them into being his champions to steal back the Starstone, which must be given freely or taken bloodily in battle. They were taught a spell with which they could lure Jarell through the gateway and into the Warlock's own realm, where they would have the advantage over her. As we left them, this spell had just been cast, putting Smith, Yarrow and Jarell through to the strange dim surface of the land beyond the gateway. And now pay attention, for our tale is about to continue, and you find yourself now in a strange land indeed.
Quest of the Starstone by C. L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, narrated by Caitlin Zavanovich. Part 2. Jarl landed on his feet like the cat he was, guns still gripped and ready, black eyes blinking in the starry dark. Smith, hampered by the terrified Jarell, sank with nightmare ease to the ground and rebounded a little from its sponginess. The impact knocked the stump of sword from the girl's hand, and he pitched it away into the blinding shimmer of the star-bright dark before he helped her to her feet. For once, Jory was completely subdued. The shock of having her sword melted by hellfire in her very grasp, the dizzying succession of manhandling and vertigo and falling into infinity, had temporarily knocked all violence out of her, and she could only gasp and stare about this incredible starlit darkness, her red lips parted in amazement. As far as they could see, the mists of stars quivered and thickened the dim air, tiny points of light that danced all around them, as if thousands of fireflies were winking all at once. Half blinded by that queer, shimmering dazzle, they could make out no familiar topography of hills or valleys, only that spongy dark ground beneath them, that quiver of stars blinding the dim air. Motion swirled the shimmer a little distance away, and Jarell snarled as Frenga's dark-robed form came shouldering through the stars, spinning them behind him in the folds of his cloak as he moved forward. His withered features grimaced into a grin when he saw the dazed three. "Ah, you have her," he rasped. "Well, what are you waiting for? Take the stone, she carries it on her." Smith's pale eyes met the Warlock's through that star shimmer, and his firm lips tightened. Something was wrong. He sensed it unmistakably. Danger whispered in the air. For why should Franga have brought them here if the problem was no more complex than the mere wresting of a jewel from a woman? No. There must be some other reason for plunging them into this starry dimness. What had Franga hinted? Powers here that were favorable to him? Some dark, nameless god dwelling among the stars? The warlock's eyes flared at Jarrell in a flash of pure murder, and suddenly Smith understood a part of the puzzle. She was to die, then, when the jewel could no longer protect her. Here Franga could wreak vengeance unhampered, once the Starstone was in his hands. Here Jory was alone and helpless, and the flame of hatred in the wizard's eyes could be quenched by no less than the red flood of her bloody death. Smith glanced back at Jarrell, white and shaken with recent terror, but snarling feebly at the warlock in invincible savagery that somehow went to his heart as no helplessness could have done. And suddenly he knew he could not surrender her up to Franga's hatred. The shift of scene had shifted their relations, too, so that the three mortals, he could not think of Franga as wholly human, stood together against Franga and his malice and his magic. No, he could not betray Jarrell. His gaze flicked Jarl's with a lightning message more eloquent than a warning shout. It sent a joyous quiver of tautening along the little Venusian's body, and both men's gun hands dropped to their sides with simultaneous casualness. Smith said, "Return us to Jory, and I'll get the stone for you. Here? No." That black glare of murder shifted from Jarrell to Smith, bathing him in hatred. "Take it from her now, or die." A smothered sound like the snarl of an angry beast halted Smith's reflexive snatch at his gun. Past him Jarrell lunged, her red hair streaming with stars, her fingers flexed into claws as she leaped bare-handed at the warlock. Rage had drowned out her momentary terror, and soldiers' curses tumbled blistering from her lips as she sprang. Franga stepped back. His hand moved intricately, and between him and the charging fury the starlight thickened, solidified into a sheet like heavy glass. Jarrell dashed herself against it and was hurled back as if she had plunged into a stone wall. The silvery mist of the barrier dissolved as she reeled back, gasping with rage, and Franga laughed thinly. "I am in my own place now, vixen," he told her. "I do not fear you or any man here. It is death to refuse me, bloody death. Give me the stone." "I'll tear you to rags with my bare nails," sobbed Jory. "I'll have the eyes out of your head, you devil. Ha! Even here you fear me. Come out from behind your rampart and let me slay you." "Give me the stone." The wizard's voice was calm. "Return us all to Jory, and I think she'll promise to let you have it." Smith fixed a meaning stare upon Jarrell's blazing yellow eyes. She shrugged off the implied advice furiously. "Never! Yeah, wait!" She leaped to Jarl's side, and as he shied nervously away, his eyes mistrustfully on her pointed nails, snatched from his belt the small knife he carried. She set the blade against the full, high swell of her bosom and laughed in Franga's face. "Now, kill me if you can," she taunted, her face a blaze of defiance. "Make one move to slay me, and I slay myself, and the jewel is lost to you forever." Franga bit his lip and stared at her through the mist of stars, fury glaring in his eyes. There was no hesitancy in her, and he knew it. She would do as she threatened, and "The stone had no virtue if not taken by violence or given freely," he admitted. "Lifted from a suicide's corpse, it would lose all value to anyone." "I will bargain with you then, Jory." "You'll not. You'll set me free or lose the jewel forever." Franga turned goaded eyes on Smith. "Either way I lose it. For once in her own land, Jory would die before surrendering it, even as she would here. You! Fulfill your bargain. Get me the Starstone." Smith shrugged. "Your meddling spoiled everything now. There's little I can do." The angry black eyes searched his for a long moment, evil crawling in their deeps. They flicked to Jarl. Both men stood on the spongy ground with feet braced, bodies balanced in the easy tautness which characterizes the gunman. Hands light on their weapons, eyes very steady, very deadly. They were two very dangerous men, and Smith realized that even here, Franga was taking no chances with their strange weapons. Behind them, Jarrell snarled like an angry cat, her fingers flexing themselves involuntarily. And suddenly, The wizard shrugged. "Stay here then and rot," he snapped, swinging his cloak so that the stars swirled around him in a blinding shower. "Stay here and starve and thirst until you'll surrender. I'll not bargain with you longer." They blinked in the sudden eddy of that starry mist, and when their vision cleared, the bent black figure had vanished. Blankly, they looked at one another through the drifting stars. "Now what?" said Jarl. "Sure, but I could drink. Why did he have to mention thirst?" Smith blinked about him in the swirling brightness. For once, he was utterly at a loss. The wizard had every advantage over them in this dim, blinding outland, where his god reigned supreme. "Well, what have we to lose?" he shrugged at last. "He's not through with us, but there's nothing we can do. And I'm for exploring a bit anyhow." Jarl raked the starry dark with a dubious gaze. "We couldn't be worse off," he admitted. "Comment?" demanded Jarrell, suspicious eyes shifting from one to the other. Smith said briefly, "We're going to explore. Franga's got some trick in mind, we think. We'd be fools to wait here for him to come back. Oh, wait!" He snapped his fingers involuntarily and turned a startled face on the surprise, too. "The gateway! He knew the spell that opened it. Franga had taught him that. Why not voice the invocation now and see what happened?" He drew a quick breath and opened his mouth to speak, and then faltered with the remembered words fading from his very tongue tip. His fingers rose half-heartedly in the intricate gestures of the spell, groping after the vanished memory, as if it could be plucked out of the star-misted air. No use. His mind was as blank of the magical remembrance as if it had never been. Franga's magic worked well indeed. "Are you crazy?" demanded Jarl, regarding his hesitating ally with an amazed gaze. Smith grinned ruefully. "I thought I had an idea," he admitted, "but it's no good. Come on." The spongy ground was wicked to walk on. They stumbled against one another, swearing in a variety of tongues at the blinding air they groped through. The hard going underfoot, the wretched uncertainty that kept their eyes scanning the dazzle as they walked. It was Jarrell who first caught sight of the shrunken brown thing. Indeed, she almost stumbled over it. A mummified body, curled up on its side so that its bony knees nearly touched the brown, fleshless forehead. Smith turned to her little gasp, saw the thing, and paused to bend over it wonderingly. It was not pleasant to see. The skin, stretched tightly over the bony frame, was parchment brown, hideously rough in texture, almost as if the hide of some great lizard had been stretched over the skeleton of a man. The face was hidden, but the hands were slender claws, whitish in places where the granulated skin had been stripped from the bone. Wisps of straw-like hair still clung to the wrinkled scalp. "Well, come along," said Jarl impatiently. "Certainly he can't help us, or harm us either." Silently assenting, Smith swung on his heel. But some instinct, the little tingling danger note that whispers in the back of a spaceman's head, made him turn. The position of the recumbent figure had changed. Its head was lifted, and it was staring at him with swollen, glazed eyes. Now, the thing should have been dead. Smith knew that, somehow, with a dreadful certainty. The face was a brown skull mask with a vaguely canine cast, and the nose, although ragged and eaten away in places, protruded with a shocking resemblance to a beast's muzzle. The limbs of the horde twitched and moved slowly, and the skeletal, tattered body arose. It dragged itself forward among the whirling star motes, and instinctively Smith recoiled. There was something so unutterably dreary about it, despite the dreadful attitude of hunger that thrust its beast's head forward, that he sickened a little as he stared. From Jarrell came a little cry of repugnance, quickly muffled. "We'd better get out of here," said Smith harshly. Jarl did not speak for a moment. Then he murmured, "There are more of the things, N.W. See?" Hidden by the starry mists close to the ground, the ghastly things must have been closing in upon them with that hideous, dreary slowness for the past several minutes. They came on, scores of them veiled in stars, moving with a dreadful deliberation, and none of them stood upright. From all sides they were converging, and the dancing motes lent them a curious air of nightmare unreality, like carven gargoyles seen through a fog. For the most part they came on hands and knees, withered brown skull faces and glaring bulbous eyes staring blindly at the three. For it seemed to Smith that the beings were blind. The swollen eyes were quite whitish and pupilless. There was nothing about them that savored of the breathing flesh which they so hideously caricatured, save the terrible hunger of their approach, made doubly hideous by the fact that those rotting jaws and parchment-dry bellies could never satisfy it by any normal means. The deformed muzzles of some of them were twitching, and Smith realized abruptly what instinct had led them here. They hunted, apparently, by scent, and their circle was closing in, so that the three humans, recoiling before that creeping, dryly rustling approach, stood very close together now, shoulder to shoulder. Smith felt the girl shudder against him, and then give him a swift, sidelong glance, hot with anger that she should have betrayed weakness, even for a moment. A little hesitantly, he drew his heat gun. There was something a bit incongruous about the very thought of shooting at these already dead things. But they were coming closer, and the prospect of contact with those brown, scaling bodies was so repulsive that his finger pressed the trigger almost of its own volition. One of the approaching horrors toppled over, the left arm completely burnt from its body. Then it regained its balance and crawled onward with a crab-like sidewise motion, the severed arm forgotten behind it, although the skeleton fingers writhed and clawed convulsively. The creature made no outcry, and no blood flowed from the wound. "Sure," breathed Jarl. "Can't they die?" His gun jarred and bucked in his hand. The head of the nearest horror became a blackened, cindery stub, but the thing betrayed no pain. It crawled on slowly, the nimbus of swirling stars like a malefic halo around the burned remnant of a head. "Jarl," said Smith sharply. "Double strength. We'll cut a path through them. Follow us, Jarrell." Without waiting for an acknowledgement, he flicked over a lever on his heat gun's muzzle and sent the searing ray flaming through the dark. The stars danced more swiftly, troubled. Smith sensed a quick, intangible menace in their aroused motion. It was as though something, drowsy and dreaming, had awakened suddenly from slumber to confront the intruders in this strange land. Yet nothing happened. The stars raced back from the heat-ray's beam, but the crawling monsters paid it no attention, even though they blackened into cinders as they crept. The dry, rustling hordes of them advanced straight into the heat gun's path, and crisped into ruin, and crunched under the feet of their destroyers into fragments that twitched and squirmed with unquenchable animation too hideous to be called life. Jarl and Smith and Jarrell moved forward over brittle black things that still moved and crunched and crept beneath their feet. The two heat guns hissed softly, mowing a path. Jarrell's yellow eyes dwelt speculatively on Smith's brawny back, and once she touched Jarl's dagger sheathed at her side, but she made no hostile move. So they won free at last from the withered brown horrors, although until the thickening star mist hid them, Smith could see the nightmare horde crawling behind them, slowly, inexorably. And ever the stars danced and swung in their oddly patterned orbits, seeming to watch with detached and sardonic amusement as the three moved on. The misty brilliance thickened about them, sometimes until they could not see each other's faces. Sometimes it thinned so that the distances were visible. Long corridors of emptiness stretched through the stars. Along one of these aisles, at last they caught a glimpse of rising ground, and turned toward it in some hopeless hope of escape. The spongy earth became firmer as they advanced, until by the time they reached the upland, they were walking on black, splintered rock, from which a sort of star-veiled mountain rose into the misty upper air. Here the stars thickened about them again, so that they could see nothing, but they stumbled up the jagged slope blindly, clutching at the rock with slipping fingers as they helped one another from ledge to ledge. In Smith, as he mounted the difficult slopes, a fever of exploration had begun to burn so hotly that their danger retired to the back of his mind. What lay ahead? What unimaginable heights, rearing among the stars? What lands beyond the mountain? He was not to know, then or ever. The slope had grown steeper and more rugged at every step. There was no progress save by painful climbing, and now, as Smith braced his back against a rocky outcropping, straining upward to his full height, as he supported Jarl's scrambling boots, which a moment before had left his shoulders, His arms encountered a queer, thick obstruction in the starry mist overhead. Full of the desire to know what lay ahead, his mind intent on helping Jarl to a foothold above, he scarcely heeded it, until the obstruction had thickened until he could hardly move his hands. Then the shock of memory jarred him sickeningly awake, as he recalled the wall of mist that had solidified between Franga and Jarl. He moved with whiplash swiftness to jerk his arms down, but not quite swiftly enough. That thickening mist had turned to strong steel about his wrists, and after a moment of surging struggle against it, while the veins stood out on his forehead and the blood thundered in his ears, he relaxed against the stone, stretched painfully to full height, so that he almost swung from his prisoned wrists, and blinked about him in the dazzling dim air, searching for Franga. He knew now, with a sick regretfulness, that danger had never been farther from them in the mist than they had been from one another. Franga must have moved invisibly at their sides, waiting patiently for the men's hands to stretch far enough from their guns so that his shackles could prison them before they could reach the weapons. Well, he had them now. From above, Jarl's voice, muffled in the starry mist, spoke passionately of gods and devils. Smith heard boots thrashing upon the rock and realized that the little Venusian must be struggling with bonds like his own. As for himself, he stood spread-eagled with his back to the mountain and his face to the starry void, boots braced on a long slope of rising stone. He saw Jarell's back as she loitered below them on the slope, waiting for their call that the next highest ledge had been reached. He said quietly, "Jory," and met her gaze with a small, rueful grin. Well, what? She was at his side before the question was out of her mouth, a blaze smoldering in her yellow eyes as she saw what had happened. Then she said viciously, "Good. This comes of trafficking with warlocks. May you hang there till you rot." "Heh," came a dry chuckle from behind her. "He'll do just that, Jory, if he doesn't obey my commands." Franga came shuffling up the slope, emerging from the stars as from a thick fog, his malice-bright eyes gloating on the prisoned men. From above, Jarl's voice poured smoking Venusian curses upon the wizard's unheeding head. Jarell matched his fervor with a hot French oath and spun toward Franga purposefully. He smiled crookedly and stepped back, his hands weaving in the air between them, and once more the cloudy barrier thickened in the dimness. Through it, in a triumphant voice, Franga called to Smith, "Now will you fulfill your bargain and wrest the jewel from Jarell?" Smith pressed his head back against the stone and said wearily, "Not until you return us to Jory." The warlock's eyes were on his, and in the baffled fury glaring there, he thought he read suddenly the full reason why they had been brought here. Franga had no thought of paying the debt he had contracted, nor of letting any of the three escape alive. Once the stone was surrendered, they would die here, in some unimaginable way, and their bones would whiten until Judgment Day in the darkness at the mountain's foot. Their only hope of salvation lay in their ability to bargain with Franga over the Starstone. So he shut his lips on the refusal and shifted his shoulders to ease his already aching arms. The weight of the gun on his leg was a tantalization almost unbearable, so near and yet so hopelessly far from his shackled hands. Franga said, "I think I can change your mind." His hands behind the barrier moved cryptically, and there came a stirring in the stars that danced between him and Smith. They moved as if fireflies were swarming there, moved toward Smith and swirled about him dizzyingly, blindingly, so that the eye despaired of following their motion. They turned into streaks of flame spinning about him, and now the nearest brushed across his cheek. At the touch, he started involuntarily, jerking back his head from the flame, for it was hot with a heat that sent pain stabbing deeper than a ray burn through his flesh. Above him he heard Jarl's sharply caught breath, and knew that the hot pain was upon him too. He set his teeth and stared through the swirl at the warlock, his eyes pale and deadly. The spinning flames closed in, brushing his body with scores of tiny tongues, and at every touch the white-hot pain of their torment leaped through him, until it seemed to him that every inch of his body flamed with deep, running agony. Through the blinding pain and the blinding shimmer, Franga's voice rasped, "Will you do my bidding?" Stubbornly, Smith shook his head. clinging, even in the hot torture of the flames, to the desperate hope which was all that remained to him, that so long as Franga had not the Starstone, he dared not kill them. Smith had endured pain before, he could endure it now, long enough to hold Franga to his bargain. And Jarl must endure it with him for a while. The Venusian had a shameless sort of bravery against physical pain, for the simple reason that he could not endure it, quietly fainted, and was out of it, if called upon, to suffer long. Smith hoped he reached that point soon. He said, "No," shortly, between clenched teeth, and pressed his head back against the rock, feeling sweat gather on his forehead as the flashing streaks of flame seared by him, every touch sending deep agony flaming through his flesh. Franga laughed in a brief, hard cackle and gestured with one hand, and the star swirls began to flash like knives before Smith's eyes. If they had flamed before, now they dazzled too blindingly to follow. The deep, hot torture of their flickering roared over him in a storm of agony, so that the torment wiped out all thought of Franga or Jarl or Jarl or anything but his own racked flesh, flaming with ray-hot pain. He did not know that his fists were clenched above the shackles, or that the muscles stood out in ridges along his jaws, as he fought to keep the agony voiceless behind his teeth. The world was a hell of unbearable torment that swept him on a white-hot tide of pain, deep into blazing oblivion. He did not even feel the drag on his wrists as his knees gave way beneath him. Jarl had been watching with mingling emotions as the stars began to swirl into flames about her tall enemy. Triumph was foremost among them, as resentment and fury were foremost among her thoughts just then. But somehow, she who had looked heartily on torture many times before now felt a queer, hot weakness rising in her as the stars became brushing flames, and she saw the sweat beading Smith's forehead and his fists clench against the rock. Then Franga's hateful voice demanded that he rob her by violence of her jewel, and she had tensed herself involuntarily to the struggle before she heard Smith's tortured but resolute, "No." She stared at him then, half in amazement, her mind whirling with wonder at his motives, and a small, reluctant admiration was coloring her resentment of him as she watched. Jarl was a connoisseur of torture, and she could not remember a man who had endured it more resolutely than Smith. Nor was there a sound from Jarl, half hidden in the starry mist above them, though the small flames streaked the dimness even there. Then she saw the tenseness melting from Smith's racked body as his long legs buckled at the knees, saw him collapse against the mountainside, swinging by his wrists from the shackles, and a sudden fury of sympathy and hot emotion rushed over her, a sudden gust of pain in his pain. Without realizing how it had happened, she found herself beating with clenched fist against the barrier that parted her from Franga, heard her own voice crying, "Stop it! Stop! Let him go free! I give you the Starstone!" In the deeps of his pain-flaming oblivion, Smith heard that high, passionate cry. The significance of it jolted him back into the memory that a world existed outside the burning circle of his agony. And with infinite effort, he lifted his sagging head, found a footing on the rocky slope once more, struggled back into consciousness and flaming anguish. He called in a voice as hoarse as if it had screamed itself raw. "Jarl! Jarl, you fool, don't do it! He'll kill us all! Jarl!" If she heard him, she did not heed. She was wrenching with both hands at the doe-skin tunic buckled at her throat, and Franga, the barrier dissolving, leaned eagerly forward with clawed hands outstretched. "Don't, Jarl, don't!" yelled Smith despairingly through the dazzle of the flames, as the leather parted, and suddenly, blindingly, the Starstone flamed in her hands. Even his own hot pain was blotted for a moment from Smith's mind as he stared. Franga bent forward, breath sucked in, eyes riveted upon the great, pale glory of the jewel. There was utter silence in that strange, dim place, as the Starstone blazed through the dusk, its cold, still pallor burning in Jarl's fingers like a block of frozen flame. Looking down, she saw again her own fingers distorted through its translucency, saw again that queer moving flicker, as if a shadow stirred in the deeps of the stone. For a moment, it seemed to her as if these smooth, cool surfaces against her hands enclosed a space as vast as the heavens. In a moment of sudden vertigo, she might have been staring deep into an infinity, through whose silences moved a something that filled it from edge to edge. Was it a world she held here, as vast in its own dimensions as space itself, even though her narrow hands cradled it between them? And was there not a dweller in that vast glowing place, a moving shadow that— Jarrell! Smith's pain-hoarse voice startled her out of her dreaming daze. She lifted her head and moved toward him, half visible in the swirl of his torture, holding the jewel like a lamp in her hands. Don't do it, begged Smith, gripping hard at his ebbing consciousness as the flames stabbed through him. Free him, she commanded Franga, feeling her own throat constrict inexplicably as she saw the pain etched upon Smith's scarred face. You surrender the stone willingly? The warlock's eyes were ravenous upon her hands. Yes, only free him. Smith choked on his own desperation as he saw her holding out the jewel. At any cost he knew he must keep it from Franga's clutches, and to his pain-dazed brain there seemed only one way for that. How it would help he did not stop to think, but he pulled all his weight on his prisoned wrist, swinging his long body through the burning stars in an arc as he kicked the jewel from Jarrell's outstretched hands. She gasped. Franga screamed in a thin, high note that quivered with terror as the Starstone was dashed from her hands against the jagged rock of mountainside. There was a cracking sound that tinkled like broken glass, and then a pale, bright glory rolled up in their faces, as if the light that dwelt in the jewel were pouring out of its shattered prison. The winking stars were swallowed up in its splendor. The dim air glowed and brightened. The whole mountainside was bathed in the calm, still glory that a moment before had blazed in the Starstone's deeps. Franga was muttering frantically, twisting his hands in spells that accomplished nothing, gabbling in a cracked voice incantations that evoked no magic. It was as if all his power had melted with the melting stars, the vanished dimness, and he stood unprotected in the full glow of this alien light. Smith was scarcely heeding it, for as the great pale glory billowed up about him, the flashing torment of the stars vanished, as their flames vanished, and the utter bliss of peace after pain left him so weak with relief that as the shackles dissolved about his wrists, he could only reel back against the rock while waves of near oblivion washed over him. A rattling and scuffling sounded above him, and Jarl's small form slid to the ground at his feet in the complete relaxation of unconsciousness. There was a silence while Smith breathed deeply and slowly, gathering strength again, while Jarl stirred in the beginnings of awakening, and Franga and Jarrell stared about them in the broadening light from the Starstone. Then down about them swept a thing that can be called only a shadow of light, a deeper brilliance in the glory of the pale day about them. Smith found himself staring directly into its blazing heart, unblinded, although he could make out no more than the shadowy outlines of a being that hung above them, inhuman, utterly alien, but not terrible, not menacing, a presence as tangible as flame, and as intangible. And somehow he sensed a cool and impersonal regard, an aloof, probing gaze that seemed to search the depths of his mind and soul. He strained his eyes, staring into the heart of the white blaze, trying to make out the nature of the being that regarded him. It was like the graceful war of a nautilus. And yet he sensed that his eyes could not fully comprehend the unearthly curves and spirals that followed a fantastic non-Euclidean system of some alien geometry. But the beauty of the thing he could recognize, and there was a deep awe within him, and a feeling of fathomless delight in the wonder and beauty of the being he gazed on. Franga was screaming thinly and hoarsely, falling to his knees to hide his eyes from the deep splendor. The air quivered, the shadow of brilliance quivered, and a thought without words quivered, too, through the minds of the three at the mountain's foot. For this release we are grateful, said a voiceless voice as deep and still and somehow flaming as the light that made it manifest. We, whom strong magic prisoned in the Starstone ages ago, would grant one last favor before we return to our own place again. Ask it of us. Oh, return us home again! gasped Jarrell before Smith could speak. "Take us out of this terrible place and send us home!" Abruptly, almost instantaneously, the shadow of light enveloped them, swept blindingly about them all. The mountain dropped away underfoot. The glory-bright air swept sidewise into nothingness. It was as if the walls of space and time opened up all around them. Smith heard Franga's shriek of utter despair, saw Jarrell's face whirled by him with a sudden, desperate message blazing in her yellow eyes, the red hair streaming like a banner in the wind. And then that dazzle all about him was the dull gleam of steel walls, and cold steel surface was smooth against his cheek. He lifted his head heavily and stared in silence into Jarl's eyes across the table, in the little Martian drinking booth he had left an aeon ago. In silence, the Venusian returned that long stare. Then Jarl leaned back in his chair and called, "Marnock! Liquor, quick!" and swung round and began to laugh softly, crazily. Smith groped for the glass of Seeger whiskey he had pushed away when he rose from this table ages past. He threw back his head and tossed the liquid down his throat with a quick, stiff-wristed gesture, closing his eyes as the familiar warmth burned through him. Behind the closed lids flashed the remembrance of a keen, pale face, whose eyes blazed with some sudden violence of emotion, some message he would never know, whose red streaming hair was a banner on the wind. The face of a girl dead 2,000 years in time, light years of space away, whose very dust was long lost upon the bright winds of earth. Smith shrugged and drained his glass.
And welcome back. That was the conclusion of Quest of the Starstone by C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, and if you enjoyed that, they have many works available in the public domain. Check Project Gutenberg at gutenberg.org for free ebook downloads. Despite knocking on nearly 90 years old, this still has a sprightly pace to it. It is soaked in that classic sword and sorcery ambience that I love. The castle on the hill, the magical gem stolen from an unambiguously evil warlock, courage and honour and heroism. It says a lot about my upbringing, to be honest, that I can mostly envision it in 16-bit pixel graphics like an old point-and-click adventure, Defender of the Crown and its ilk. It's refreshing, too, that it's not soaked in so much of the misogyny and other prejudice of the era, so common to many other contemporary pulp tales. It may not have much to say beyond giving us a rollicking good adventure, but my goodness, what an adventure, eh? That was our show for this week. On behalf of everyone at PodCastle, your co-editors Shingai Enjeri Kagunda and Eleanor R. Wood, assistant editor Caitlin Zavanovich, audio engineers Devin Martin and Eric Valdez, forum moderator Ossicat and our many wonderful first readers, Andrew Cahoe, Craig Jackson, Amalia Harrington, Julia Patt, Kieran Corsini, Ryan Cole, Sarah S. Messenger, Sophie Barker, Shrikripa Krishna Prasad, Tarvanova, Tierney Bailey, Zeev Witties, and myself, Matt Dovey. Thank you for letting us share another story with you. The legal bit. PodCastle is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can share it, and please do, but you cannot sell it and you cannot change it. If you want specifics, check creativecommons.org. Our music is by Shiva in Exile. Everything we do on PodCastle is 100% donor funded, and if you'd like to support what we and the rest of EA do, please join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/EA Podcasts. Prefer another method? There's details for supporting us via Twitch, Amazon Prime, Ko-fi and PayPal on escapeartist.net. We'll be back next Tuesday with another fantastic tale. In the meantime, you might care to check our sister podcasts, Escape Pod for science fiction, Pseudopod for horror, Cast of Wonders for YA speculative fiction, and Catscast for speculative cat stories. If your heart belongs to us, though, we'll see you next week. Be safe and be kind.